The Senate was preparing to leave Washington for a 5-week August recess, with one of President Trump's biggest legislative priorities still unresolved. The Save America Act had not passed. The chamber was running out of time, and under the normal Senate calendar, lawmakers were about to head home with the central problem exactly where it had been for months. Then Mike Lee objected. That objection mattered because the fight was never just about whether senators took a recess. It was about the arithmetic standing between Republicans and the election bill Trump wanted passed before November. Republicans controlled the Senate 53-47. But under the legislative filibuster, most legislation still faced an effective 60-vote threshold. That left a 7-vote gap between the Republican conference and the number needed to advance the bill under the existing rules. Trump had repeatedly pushed Senate leadership to solve that problem. His position was straightforward: scrap the legislative filibuster or find another route that could move the Save America Act forward. Senate leadership had resisted both options, arguing that Republicans simply did not have the votes to overcome the current threshold. So the numbers were frozen. 53 Republicans, 60 votes needed, and an August recess approaching fast. The Save America Act, as described in the source, would require proof of U.S. citizenship when registering to vote and valid photo identification when casting a ballot. Trump had elevated the legislation to the top of his 2026 agenda, making the Senate's inability to move it increasingly difficult to separate from the larger political fight over the chamber's rules. That tension became sharper when Trump publicly called on senators to remain in Washington rather than begin the August break before acting on the legislation. But staying in Washington presented its own problem. Senate leadership's argument was that additional days on the calendar would not magically produce the 7 Democratic votes needed to reach 60. Without either Democratic support or a change in procedure, keeping the chamber in session could result in more time on the floor without changing the final outcome. That was the leadership position. The counter-argument was about accountability. Normally, the Senate can move into an adjournment or recess through unanimous consent without turning the decision into a major recorded confrontation. If no senator objects, the chamber can move on without the kind of public fight that forces individual members to defend the decision. That is where the pressure campaign began. Outside the Senate, activist Scott Presler publicly challenged a Republican senator to object to unanimous consent and force the issue into the open. His message was simple: if senators were going to leave Washington while the Save America Act remained unresolved, someone should make them confront that decision publicly. Mike Lee answered. Lee publicly addressed Senate leadership and announced that he objected to any effort to move into the August recess before the Save America Act was addressed. Then he made his position unmistakable. Do not assume you have my consent. You do not. Those words changed the procedural landscape of the fight. Lee had not produced 7 new votes. He had not eliminated the filibuster, and he had not passed the Save America Act. What he had done was remove the assumption that the Senate could move toward recess without resistance from inside the Republican conference. That distinction matters. The central question was no longer only whether Republicans had 60 votes for the legislation. It was whether Senate leadership could continue treating the August break as routine while members of its own conference were publicly demanding that the chamber stay and fight. Lee reinforced the message days later with an even simpler demand. Let's cancel recess. At first, it was one senator. It would not stay that way for long. Rick Scott of Florida was the next senator to step forward. He publicly backed Lee's effort to keep the Senate in session, arguing that lawmakers should remain in Washington and continue working on election legislation rather than leave with the issue unresolved. Then, the pressure widened. Within days, more than a dozen Republican senators had either called for canceling the recess or expressed support for staying in Washington until the election security fight was addressed. The group included senators willing to challenge the August calendar directly and others who stopped short of demanding a complete cancellation, but agreed that the chamber should remain if there were votes that could produce a meaningful result. That distinction quickly became the center of the fight. John Thune did not simply dismiss the pressure. He told reporters he was open to delaying or canceling part of the recess if senators could actually accomplish something, but he also made clear that keeping the chamber physically open would not solve the underlying arithmetic. The Save America Act still faced the same obstacle it had before Lee objected: 60 votes. Republicans had 53. Unless Democrats joined them or the rules changed, more days in Washington would not automatically produce passage. Thune's argument was that the Senate could spend additional time in session without changing that reality. If lawmakers were left sitting through procedural delays and quorum calls with no pathway to an actual result, remaining in Washington could become political theater rather than legislative progress. Lee's side saw the situation differently. The point was not that one objection could magically create 7 additional votes. The point was that senators should not be able to move from an unresolved legislative fight into a lengthy recess without facing public pressure over that decision. That is what made Lee's objection consequential. The Senate often relies on unanimous consent agreements to handle routine scheduling matters. When there is no objection, those arrangements can move quickly and with little drama. Lee's refusal meant leadership could no longer simply assume that every Republican would cooperate with the normal path toward recess. The resistance was now coming from inside the conference, and the criticism came from inside it as well. One Republican senator attacked Lee's approach as performative politics and argued that lawmakers could be more useful working back home than remaining in Washington without enough votes to pass the bill. A senior Republican aide was also quoted dismissing the idea of canceling recess as a non-starter. That exposed the real divide. One side believed staying in Washington was necessary to force accountability and keep pressure on the Save America Act. The other believed accountability without a viable legislative path would produce headlines, not a law. For several days, it looked as though that argument might end exactly where Senate leadership expected. Conservatives would protest, leadership would point to the 60-vote barrier, and the chamber would eventually leave. But the objections did not disappear. Lee continued pressing the issue. Scott remained supportive. Other Republican senators joined the call to stay. Trump kept demanding movement on the legislation. What had begun as resistance from a single senator was becoming increasingly difficult for leadership to treat as an isolated complaint. And that changed what had to happen before the Senate left Washington. The full Save America Act still did not have a clear path through the filibuster. But leadership now faced growing pressure to put at least part of the election security question directly before the chamber. That distinction would become crucial, because the vote that eventually reached the Senate floor was not a vote on the full Save America Act. It focused on one major component of that broader fight, requiring photo identification to vote in federal elections. Mike Lee described the measure as roughly half of what the Save America Act was trying to accomplish. That made the coming vote something different from final passage of Trump's entire legislative priority. It was a test of how much support one of the bill's central provisions actually had inside the Senate. And for the first time in this confrontation, the argument over whether the votes existed was about to produce a number everyone could see. The Senate finally put that test on the floor. The measure required voters to show photo identification in federal elections. It represented only part of the broader Save America Act agenda, but politically it offered something the larger bill had not yet produced: a recorded vote that would show exactly how much support the photo ID provision could command. The result was 52 to 46. 52 senators voted yes, 46 voted no, and the measure still failed. The reason was the same barrier that had shaped the entire confrontation from the beginning. A simple majority was not enough. The legislation needed 60 votes to overcome the Senate's procedural threshold, and 52 did not get it there. That number immediately changed the argument. Before the vote, Senate leadership could point to the absence of 60 votes and argue that keeping senators in Washington would not alter the outcome. After the vote, that obstacle was no longer theoretical. The chamber had produced an actual tally. A majority supported the photo ID measure, but the majority was 8 votes short of what the Senate rules required. That did not mean the full Save America Act had received 52 votes. It had not. The vote covered the photo identification portion of the broader election package, not the entire citizenship proof legislation Trump had been demanding. Still, politically, the 52-46 result gave both sides something concrete. For Lee and the senators demanding action, it showed that pressure over the recess had produced an actual floor vote rather than another round of private negotiations. For Thune, it demonstrated the problem he had been pointing to all along. Even a proposal that could win more yes votes than no votes was still unable to clear the 60-vote barrier, and the Senate was still approaching recess. That left leadership, Trump, and the conservative senators pushing the issue with a choice. They could continue the confrontation immediately, or they could reach an agreement that preserved the fight for later. By Friday night, they had an agreement. According to the arrangement described Thune, Trump and Senate conservatives agreed to set aside action on a budget resolution and defer much of the Save America Act fight until after the August recess. That was not passage. It was not a repeal of the filibuster. And it did not produce the 7 additional votes Republicans still lacked. What it did was keep the legislation from disappearing completely as senators left Washington. The fight was pushed onto the fall calendar instead of being treated as finished. Lee still had one more piece of the confrontation to resolve. From the beginning, his threat had centered on the Senate's departure itself. He had objected to the assumption that leadership could move into recess through unanimous consent without resistance. When the moment arrived, however, the adjournment fight did not end with the full roll call showdown Lee had originally sought. A broader unanimous consent agreement had tied the recess schedule to other Senate business, including votes on must-pass items and a confirmation. Lee later explained that this procedural package limited the options available at the end of the session. So he compromised on the form of the vote. The Senate ultimately handled adjournment by voice vote rather than by the recorded roll call Lee had initially demanded. That meant the recess happened. Senators left Washington. The full Save America Act remained unpassed, and the central 60-vote problem was still intact. On those facts alone, Lee had not won the legislative battle. But the story did not end with the voice vote. Because once the Senate adjourned, a group of Republican senators took an additional step designed to make their own positions unmistakable. They submitted formal statements explaining how they would have voted if the adjournment question had been decided by roll call. And that created the final number in this fight: 11. Lee and 10 other Republican senators submitted statements to the congressional record stating that if the adjournment question had been decided by roll call, they would have voted no. 11 senators. That did not reverse the recess. It did not change the 52-46 result. And it did not solve the 60-vote problem standing in front of the Save America Act. But it created a permanent record of where those 11 senators said they stood. That distinction is important because the final adjournment itself had been handled by voice vote. There was no complete roll call list showing how every senator voted on whether the chamber should leave Washington. The separate statements allowed Lee and the others to register their opposition without pretending that the entire Senate had been formally recorded on the recess question. Some of those senators made their positions public outside the chamber as well. John Kennedy said he opposed sending the Senate home, while Ashley Moody argued that the chamber should not leave Washington without addressing election integrity. The photo ID vote had already given them one tangible result. 52 senators supported the measure. 46 opposed it. The proposal failed because 52 was still below the 60 votes required under the existing Senate rules. That number now sat at the center of the larger argument. For senators aligned with Lee, the vote strengthened the case that the real obstacle was procedural. A majority could support a measure and still watch it fail. For Thune and those defending the existing rules, the same tally demonstrated why simply extending the Senate calendar was never enough. 52 votes were still 8 short of 60. Staying in Washington could create more pressure, but pressure alone did not produce the missing votes. Both things could be true at once. Lee had succeeded in turning the dispute into a public confrontation. He had not succeeded in passing the full legislation. The Save America Act remained unresolved when senators left Washington. The legislative filibuster remained intact. The 5-week recess still began. And Republicans still faced the same basic arithmetic when they would eventually return. That is the limit of what happened. But it is also what made the fight politically significant. At the beginning, the Senate was approaching recess with the Save America Act stalled, and no guarantee that election legislation would receive another major floor test before lawmakers departed. By the end, a photo ID measure had received a recorded 52-46 vote. The disagreement inside the Republican conference had become public. 11 senators had formally placed their opposition to adjournment into the record, and the broader Save America Act fight had been deferred rather than resolved. The battle had moved. It had not been won. That difference matters heading into the next phase. When senators return, the central question will still be the same one that existed before Mike Lee objected. How do supporters of the Save America Act get from the votes they currently have to the 60 votes required under the present rule? Trump had pushed for a workaround. Thune had resisted changing the filibuster. Lee and other conservatives had pushed leadership to keep the issue alive rather than allow the recess to end the confrontation. None of those positions had fundamentally changed. What changed was the amount of political exposure surrounding them. The 52-46 vote gave supporters of the photo ID provision a concrete number to point to. The statements from 11 Republican senators created a separate record of opposition to leaving town, and the agreement reached before recess ensured that the broader fight would return to the Senate calendar rather than disappear completely. Lee summarized his position after adjournment with a short message. "We're not done. We're just getting started." That may be the clearest description of where the fight actually stood. Not victory. Not passage. Not the end of the recess. A postponement with the same 60-vote barrier still waiting when the Senate comes back. And that makes the next confrontation much simpler to define. The first round established where the votes were. The next one has to answer whether anything can actually change them.